Hello, and welcome to Rogue Artisans and Crafters. This is our first show, and our show is about featuring local artists and craftspeople from within Southern Oregon. We will talk to our featured artists about how they came to their art, what drives them as artists, find out stories behind their art process, and how their work as artists has affected their lives. For our first show, we have the privilege of featuring local sculptor Yvonne Kitchen. Now, I discovered Yvonne and her work just in recent weeks while visiting the Art de Jour Gallery in Medford, where her bronze sculptures are featured. And Yvonne's sculptures focus on horses and other animals, and she describes her work as bronze portraits from nature. Her work is beautiful, and I am pleased to be able to introduce her work to our audience. And with this being our first episode of Rogue Artisans and Crafters, and Yvonne's life and artwork being so remarkable, our show will be split into two parts. So be sure to look for our part 2 show to learn and more about Yvonne Kitchen. And Yvonne, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, David. It's a great privilege to be here, particularly on your very first broadcast.
Well, yeah, we hope it continues for quite a while. And, and I know that there's plenty of incredible art talent here in Southern Oregon, so we hope to be able to do a lot of shows for the future.
I certainly hope so, because we are well represented for a small valley.
Yes, we are. It's really been incredible, because I've been here, I've lived here all my life, and I've just always been amazed at the sheer volume of art talent when I go to the different galleries and shows around the valley.
Well, I've only been here since Christmas of 1992, came here as a widow and worked at Ashland Community Hospital as a nurse for the first 10 years of my career here.
Right.
And I only became full-time sculptor in the early 2000s.
Okay.
So it's kind of a new thing, but I've been an artist all my life.
Well, yeah, when I would talk to you earlier in the week, I mean, I was amazed to learn how long you've been doing this, and that you have art still that you did as a child.
That's right.
So I find that pretty remarkable in itself, too. And so with this first show, we're going to want to talk about your art process as an artist.
Okay.
And how you came to moving from the art that you've done as in your younger days to getting to the point of doing these incredible bronze sculptures, which I find just absolutely incredible to look at.
Well, all my life I've worked very detailed, and I started out drawing, and I was only 3 years old when my father actually, who had a heart attack, he and I would sit in his hospital bed in our dining room drawing together, and I still hear in my head his voice saying, "Yvonne, if you want to draw horses, you have to really look at how the legs go." And he was literally teaching me anatomy when I was 3 years old by getting me books and showing me in photographs how they went and describing, rather than doing this, how little kids draw things and the legs just kind of curve like this. And so he actually pointed on the photographs to say, no, there's bones inside there. So he was teaching me anatomy.
Yeah.
And his art was very, very detailed, and he drew mainly athletic events in pen and ink, which of course is a very detailed medium. And my grandfather, my mother's father, also was a pastel artist. So most of my life I've done drawing, working in graphite and colored pencil, watercolor pencil, and pastel, rather than oil, although I've done oil paintings and acrylics and watercolor, but those are not my favorite things. I like something where I can work very detailed. You can tell by my bronzes, even at this stage, that realism matters to me a great deal, and I've also had the privilege of having a life which was full of animals, and so I've had lots of models to work from.
Well, it definitely reflects in the sculptures of your work that I've seen. I mean, I'm just amazed at the detail to the muscles, and just there's just such subtle realism to the details in your work, and I just find that incredibly amazing to look at.
Well, part of what's made it very easy for me to learn muscles, particularly, is that I learned to clip horses at a very young age. And when you're clipping an animal, and I went from that to shearing sheep. We raised purebred sheep for many, many years, and I showed sheep. And I love the whole business of those clippers going across the body, and you can't learn anatomy any better than you can with the pair of clippers in your hand.
Right.
And grooming the animals, because I'm very tactile and actually feeling where the muscles are.
Yes.
And so I literally can and do. I don't know if the camera shows low enough. Some of my little sculptures I do them sitting in my lap, and I can actually do them with the lights off. I'm actually feeling that conformation rather than having to visually see it.
Right. Well, it's and we've got examples here of your little sculptures that you do, and then your larger pieces at the kind of like at the beginning stages of your work.
Right. And in fact, I deliberately brought Bella is the name of the Great Dane bust that is there, and then this is Ebony, and Ebony is a commission piece that is almost complete that I'm working on right now. It's almost ready to go to the foundry. So I'm just smoothing it out, and I'm doing the last details, like I have not yet added the veins to her face and to the legs and those sort of things, which come at the very, very end. So that's kind of two different stages. It also demonstrates that I brought along some tools and things that I use. The starting place for a four-legged animal is an armature that looks like this, and it ultimately, what an armature is a skeleton for the animal. So you screw this down to the wood base, and then this T is where the center point that everything goes, it's balanced off of that, and so the forward to the head, and then to the tail, and of course that would be cut back off on those length of the animal, and so that is your starting place that has to be solid and in place very tightly. On a four-legged animal, what you then do is you use a finer wire, twist it. In fact, this is the gauge aluminum wire that I actually use, and I literally twist them together like so, and then make a loop at the end, and that is literally screwed down to the base. So I position where the legs are going to be with this twisted aluminum that is attached and runs forward and back over that.
Okay.
So that's the starting place, and then you start building up clay. Now with a bust, you can do one thing differently, and many people do. Rather than start, they do start with the T and with a heavy aluminum wire again, but they can actually take styrofoam and make sort of a block figure of the head, what it's going to be, and then build clay on that, which makes it lighter.
Right. Okay.
This particular one was done, that's solid clay all the way through.
Okay.
But what's interesting about these guys is even though you're sculpting solid, when it goes to the foundry, and we'll talk a little bit about the lost wax process later on, what they're going to do is they literally are going to cut this apart so that they can make molds of it, and then when it's cast in bronze, it will be hollow.
Right, okay.
So that's part of the artisans that are at the foundry, because they are every bit as much an artist as I am.
Yes.
They can duplicate in metal everything that I do in clay.
Right.
Which is the first time you go to a foundry as an artist, and they kind of step you through. It's quite a learning process. So I brought along a few of the tools that I use that make it as exact as it is. And the lady, I'm hoping she sees this film, whose horse this is. I'll have to tell her that I will smooth it back out when I do this. Okay. But one of the things that I do is everything has to be. Can I do this?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. What I will do is I stick pins. I used to do toothpicks, now I use pins. And I have a line of them coming down the spine. And then I take calipers, and I literally measure that from the spine to the hip, is equal. I also take my calipers, and I measure that every single bone is equal on each leg. Right. I also measure the thickness of the leg using calipers. So detail is really, truly what I'm going for here. So I want everything to match, because truthfully, if you have one leg longer than the other, then even somebody that doesn't know horses will know that there's something wrong with that, but they can't quite put their brain, wrap it around what is it that I'm seeing that doesn't really quite match. Right. And so everything has to be in proportion and has to be equal side to side, front to rear.
And it results in a closer, subtle reality is the way I would say.
Very much so. And of course, I think that art is the way we see the world, and through our hands we are interpreting what we're seeing in the world. So
Right.
you and I could sit there and look at the same horse or the same tree or the same whatever and portray it, and it would come out slightly different.
Yes.
But whoever is looking at it would also at the same time know that it was the same tree or horse or dog or whatever
Right.
it was.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one of the fascinating things about artwork to me, is that it is what's coming out of our, not only our brain, but also out of our heart. And my art has always been very important to me from the time I was tiny. As I said, my father's who taught me to draw. When my father passed away of a heart attack at age 39 when I was 10 years old, what got me through that first year was literally I had a fifth grade teacher who allowed me to draw horses on every single piece of my schoolwork. And so, and I was always a good student, so I would get done, you know, when other people were sitting, but I'd
Yeah.
be there drawing, and my mother kept a lot of those things. So I have all kinds of things I wrote that have parts and pieces of horses all over them. And I still did that. And then many years later, when I lost my late husband after 32 years of marriage, right after our 32nd anniversary, by the way, again, my artwork is what got me through that. Is that I could literally sit down and draw, and then I could handle the grief because through
Yeah.
my artwork I was doing that.
Well, you know, when I was visiting you at your place earlier in the week and had the opportunity to really see just all the different bronze examples of your work, I mean, not only is it just, I'm struck by the sheer beauty of each piece, but you get a sense that there's a great deal of love in each piece.
Definitely.
I mean,
That's
so
you got that right.
yeah, and I think for the best artist, that you know, it's not something that just screams out, but there's always that subtle application of love to each finished piece that they do.
Right.
And I think that's what comes out in the best, strongest, most beautiful pieces of art that you
Right.
see.
Right.
Well, no matter what the format of art is.
That's right.
You know, so that definitely comes out very strong in your work, and it's a remarkable thing to see.
Well, that really is true. The other thing that people always ask me, how can you make a horse recognizable? And I truthfully, I really don't know. I think it's a God-given talent that we have to be able to do that. The owner of this particular horse, when I do the face and the detailed kinds of things like the head and the ears and all those things very much at the end. But when I showed her what it looked like when I first put those eyes in, she says, "Oh my God, you've captured her."
Yeah.
And I did a portrait of a dog at one point, and he said, "Yvonne, you caught Baxter's soul."
Yeah.
And I don't know quite how that happens, but I think all artists who are that invested in what they're doing somehow
Yes.
are able to do that, no matter the medium,
Yes.
no matter the subject.
Yeah, I totally agree with that because, you know, throughout my life, as I've seen a wide variety of art, the art that always strikes me the most is art that seems to have the greatest investment in attention by the artist to
Right.
that piece.
Right.
And that definitely comes through. If you're sensitive enough to what's around you, then that comes through really strongly.
Right, and I think that really is true, and each of us has to find our own way in what it is that is important to us to do. I really love doing three-dimensionally, which was why I ended up doing sculpture almost entirely now. I still draw, by the way. I can't talk on the telephone and not be drawing parts and pieces of dogs or horses or jaguars or whatever. I also was very privileged to be married to a veterinarian whose career, as he went to graduate school, allowed me to raise about 350 baby deer. So one of my bronzes that will be in the second half is one of the deer who was a deer we raised. That happens to be Wally, and we name everything. And so that gave me the experience of raising many, many kinds of animals, and being a nurse taking care of animals before I became an RN also taught me a lot, which again comes through my hands in my sculpture.
Yeah, well, you know, and if when you're doing a commissioned piece for someone, and they see that final piece and see their animal totally captured, then I mean that has to be.
That's my biggest joy.
Yeah, that has to be an incredible sense of appreciation for what you've done for
Very much so.
for your client.
Yes, that to me, that's the biggest thrill that I get is when, and the other, it's not only the owner of the animal. I've many times had someone who knew that animal and didn't know that I was doing the commission or that I was using that as my subject, because I often work from a photograph I take which captures a moment in time that I think would make a wonderful bronze, so that it speaks to me. And so they'll say, "Oh, was that Blackie?" And I'll say, "Yeah." and they didn't know I was doing Blackie, and so it's really quite a thrill when those people, and it's usually somebody that's knowledgeable to that species of animal and that breed or whatever, and that's happened a number of times to me. In fact, one of the pieces I brought here today, which will be in the second half, and was on that first screen, is the gray mule. And I took him at this stage, but he didn't have his ears on yet, and his eyes. And I took him to the Draft Horse Classic, which is where is my biggest booth show of the year, with all the draft horses and everything. But anyway, all the guys that are there with their mules came over and they kept saying, "Is that Concho? Is that Concho?" And I didn't even have his head completed, and they all recognized Concho, and I was just floating when they saw that. And indeed, I did not do it as a commission, but the owner of Concho, the mule, and his wife have the #1 casting of that bronze.
Yeah, well, that's an incredible recognition of your talent as an artist, when so many people can recognize a specific animal whose sculpture that you're doing.
Right.
So yeah, that's definitely says a lot about your talent and attention to detail.
Well, attention to detail, as I say, is very important to me. And as you can see on the dog face, you can still see some of the tool marks. And those marks were done by, I brought a few tools that I work with at home. And there are two tools like this, which have been carved into so that they have grooves. And so some of the texture, and a lot of artists like to leave them that rough. I happen to like to go to it's really smooth. That neither one is right or wrong. It's just it happens to be my style. But so this is this kind of tool comes in many sizes, and it can be just smooth wire or it can be etched so that it's carved. For getting into little tiny places, this little tool is another handy one. So I just brought kind of a group of representatives. Among the other tools, I have a lot of either wood or metal tools, but there's also rubber tipped ones that come in different sizes and shapes.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So we're doing good.
Okay. So this is just, you end up using everything and anything, and a number of artists, including me, more than once has used a pencil as a tool.
Okay. Well, at this point, let's run those images of the foundry process, and we can get into talking about at the next stage from this.
Okay, these are pictures that were taken at Valley Bronze in Joseph, Oregon, which is who do most of my work. And there this is actually a little earlier than that. This particular piece, which you saw them mounting on the base, actually is 2 horses. And you see they're putting the masking tape over parts of the bridle and parts of the breast collar. That's because they were done in sterling silver.
Oh, okay.
And so they had to block them off while they were finishing the rest of it. And he's literally spacing this so that they're the right distance apart. And he's saying, "Is this where you wanted it, Yvonne?" Sort of thing. So it's very collaborative.
Yeah.
And this is that same piece when it had just been put back together, and it gives you an idea of how much they cut them apart. They actually cut poor Carol in half. And this is of a local lady, by the way. And this is doing the patina, the color on it, and they've already done the dark parts on the base by dipping it in the hot metal into actually a big tub of the chemical, which is called liver. Then they cover that up so that they can do the airbrush, which is showing right now, and he's detailing that. But anything where they don't want his buckskin color to show, they're going ahead and keeping it covered with aluminum foil.
Okay.
And then this is another one of the patina artists at the same foundry doing the same piece when it was not done with the buckskin color, but left in the bronze. And you can see he's just shading the base a little bit rather than using the airbrush and putting heavy color on it. And so there you can see that we were doing more than one casting at the same time. Actually, we did 5 on that particular one. And the gentleman who's reading his book with his horse over his shoulder was a teenager at the time. And I had the yearbook photo of him from 1955 to use as my reference for that. Okay. And that his family surprised him with the casting of it, and they surprised the school where that happened with one of the castings, and their children each got one.
Oh, wow.
So that was kind of a fun one. And there she's mounting them on the base. So that's one of the last steps. And then what they're going to do is they are literally going to use Johnson's paste wax, and they're going to wax both the bronze and the base with the same kind of wax.
Yeah, okay.
So that's kind of the end.
Okay, yeah. So typically once you have a piece like this finished and ready to send to the foundry,
right?
Then there's a determination made as to how many copies are to be made,
right?
And what's the general time process for once the foundry has your piece to cutting the thing apart and doing the process and so say an order is placed for like 5 copies.
Right.
What's like the turnaround time on that kind of a process?
The turnaround time, the least turnaround time I've ever had is 6 to 8 weeks.
Okay.
Most of the time it's more like 10 to 12 weeks.
Oh wow. Okay.
And because it's a many-step process, and they can't do them all in one day, and so that makes it labor intensive, first of all.
Right.
It also means that they have to do it in an orderly fashion. They have, one step after the other, and in each step they have to make sure they examine the parts and pieces they've done at that stage and correct any mistakes that they've got.
Right.
And so that's also part of the process.
Right. So it's and with regards to the foundries, there's not that many foundries
Fine art foundries
that you can submit to have this process done. So
right. In Oregon, at this time, I'm only aware of 3 in the state of Oregon. All are up in the northeastern corner of the state. There was one in the Troutdale area, which is where I had my very first piece cast. But the gentleman that owned it, 2 brothers who are fantastic artisans but terrible businessmen. And so what happened is an artist bought them out, and so he's just casting his own work there.
Okay.
And I suspect maybe for some friends, but he's not an open one anymore. And our hope and dream, truthfully, is that Grants Pass, their dream comes true, and we actually end up with a foundry in Grants Pass. I think that would be wonderful for this area.
It really would be, because I would believe that there's enough sculptors in the area that could really probably make use of that.
Well, and I think it also has one feature, is that Grants Pass is not only right next to I-5, but I-5 looks down on Grants Pass. And so the talk from the former mayor up there, who's really pushing this effort, is to have something that's visible from the freeway. It's also very convenient to California. I-5 means that people even can come down from Washington State easily. Joseph, Oregon is the end of the road in the far eastern, northeastern part of the state. And so you have to really want to go there. It's a wonderful tourist area, by the way, fantastic. But you really have to plan on that being where you're going.
Right, yeah. And so now there's like, now I've also understand that there's, besides the foundries here in Oregon, you've also like used foundries like elsewhere too. So
all of my little bronzes are all done by a gentleman by the name of Miles Anderson in Choctaw, Montana.
Okay.
And that's all he does is small pieces.
Okay.
And so I've had a really wonderful working relationship with him for almost 10 years now, and couldn't be more pleased. But he knows what his limitations are, so he does all of these little guys.
Right. And so with these littles, because this is how you describe them.
That's my series.
Yeah, and as I look at this, I mean, I'm struck at how heavy it is.
It's solid
for such a little piece of art.
Right.
I mean, this is an extremely solid piece, but it's also still has extreme details to it. So it's really, even at this size, you're able to get an incredible realism and detail.
Right.
Because I'm looking at this, and I'm struck by the musculature that's coming across in the body and in the legs, And
Well, and the other thing about that is this is happens to be a portrait of a Shire stallion that I see every year at the Draft Horse Classic down in California, and his owners immediately recognized him in that. And this is from reference photos I took of him when he was winning his class.
right.
Yes, and even with the littles, just like my big pieces, they are all animals which I know, and they're all named. And so every single one of the pieces I do has a story.
Yeah,
That's why I do them.
Yeah, and that's what that really struck me when we were visiting earlier in the week, is that you just have an incredible variety of stories for every piece that you do.
Right.
And it was because of that that I thought, you know what, you deserve a two-part show. So that's what we're doing. So that's what we're doing.
Yeah, it's actually my two favorites of all of my littles are in front of Ebony right now. It's the little baby burro, and the rolling Clydesdale colt. And the Clydesdale colt, I happened to take pictures of him when he was probably 3 weeks old, just under a month anyway. And he rolled with those great big feet up in the air, and so I could not resist doing it. And the colt's name is Chaos. And he was named appropriately because he is quite a character.
Yeah.
And then the little burro is actually a little burro that was small enough. He was at the Draft Horse Classic one year when we had a terrible rainstorm, and the owner was able to go to the pet store and get a dog blanket for Lollipop. His name is Lollipop, and he only was probably 28 inches tall.
Right.
He's just tiny and fuzzy.
Yeah.
And so actually those two pieces, I sell more of them than any other piece I do.
Well, okay.
They're really popular.
Well, we're going to get ready to go into our next show. So right now, I'll say we have reached the end of our show for Rogue Artisans and Crafters. And we thank you at home for joining us and learning about our featured artist, Yvonne Kitchen. Stay with us for part 2, where we're going to continue to chat with Yvonne Kitchen and discuss her life as an artist and her work in bronze sculpture. We also want to thank our crew who's made it possible to put this program together. Please make sure to check out Yvonne Kitchen's website, where you can get more information about her art. And I'm your host, David Glamour Dave Nienow, and we will see you next time.